The sun had not yet touched the horizon when they brought Myrtle Merriweather to the center of Caldwell, Kansas, bound at the wrists with rough hemp rope, and the town gathered to watch like it was nothing more than a cattle sale on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the autumn of 1878. Myrtle stood 22 years old and straight-spined on the wooden platform that had been dragged out in front of the Lucky Star Saloon, her auburn hair pulled back in a knot that had come half loose from the events of the last 24 hours, her green eyes scanning the crowd with a steadiness that cost her everything she had inside. She wore a dusty calico dress the color of storm clouds, and her boots were cracked at the left heel, and there were smudges of trail dust on her cheekbones, and none of that diminished her one single fraction. She looked like a woman who had survived something and was determined to survive whatever came next. The man who had arranged this particular spectacle was Harlan Voss, and Harlan Voss was the sort of man whose prosperity rested entirely on the suffering of others. He was 43 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a thick black mustache and eyes that were the color and temperature of creek water in January. He owned the Lucky Star Saloon, 3 boarding houses along the main strip of Caldwell, and enough of the local sheriff's moral flexibility to do more or less whatever he pleased. He had acquired Myrtle through a scheme that was not at all legal and not at all unusual for a man of his particular appetites. Myrtle's father, Thomas Merriweather, had been a good man who made bad decisions when it came to card tables, and he had died 8 months prior, leaving behind a debt to Harlan Voss that amounted to $460. Thomas had left Myrtle nothing except that debt, the small house on the edge of town, and the stubborn conviction that she would find a way through. She had worked herself nearly to the bone trying to pay it back, taking in laundry, selling the furniture piece by piece, even working briefly as a cook at the hotel on 2nd Street, until Voss had called in the remainder of the debt all at once with no warning and no mercy, and declared that since she could not pay in coin, she would pay in another fashion. He had his men bring her to the platform on a Wednesday evening and told the town of Caldwell that he was holding a practical auction. He dressed it up in language that made it sound almost reasonable, almost civilized, the way men like Harlan Voss always did. He said she would be auctioned off as a bride, that the man who paid the highest sum would clear her debt and she would go with him as a wife, and the whole arrangement would be legal and final and done before sundown. The crowd that gathered was made up of rough men, mostly, the kind that came drifting through Caldwell on the cattle drives and stayed too long because the whiskey was cheap and the card games ran all night. There were also townspeople, merchants and their wives who watched from the edges with expressions that ranged from discomfort to outright disapproval, but who did nothing, because doing nothing was always the safest thing in a town where the sheriff owed his position to Harlan Voss. Myrtle stood on that platform, and she did not cry. She had made a decision somewhere between being dragged from her house and being tied at the wrists that she would not give Harlan Voss the satisfaction of her tears. She had given herself that much dignity. But inside, underneath the stillness she wore like armor, she was terrified in a way that she had no words for, a fear that had roots and branches and filled every part of her chest. The bidding started low. A rough-looking man with a sunburned neck called out $2 and was met with scattered laughter. Another man offered 20. A third offered 50, and the crowd leaned in a little, sensing that things were getting serious. Voss stood at the side of the platform with his thumbs in his belt loops, smiling the way a man smiles when he is already certain of the outcome. The man who had offered $50 was named Deke Hollies, and Myrtle knew him by reputation, which was sufficient reason to feel cold all the way through. Deke Hollies ran a small homestead south of town and was known primarily for the frequency with which his first 2 wives had needed the services of the town's single doctor. One of those wives was dead. The other had left under circumstances that nobody discussed aloud. Myrtle looked out at the crowd and felt the first crack form in her composure, thin as a hairline fracture but present, and she pressed her bound hands together against the front of her dress and breathed carefully through her nose. The back of the crowd was mostly shadows now that the sun was pulling itself toward the horizon, painting the Kansas sky in shades of orange and deep rose, and the particular bruised purple that only exists in that last half hour before dark truly falls. The main street of Caldwell smelled of horse and sawdust and the smoke from someone's chimney, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at something. That was when Myrtle noticed the man in the back row. He was standing slightly apart from the others, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the quality of his stillness. While everyone else shifted and murmured and craned their necks, he stood as if he had been carved there, his hat pushed back just enough that the fading light caught the strong line of his jaw. He was tall, lean in the way that a man gets who spends his life working rather than eating well, broad in the shoulder. He wore a plain dark coat that had seen better years and simple working clothes beneath it, and there was nothing about him that announced anything. He was the kind of man a crowd overlooks. Myrtle looked at him because she had looked at everyone else and found nothing hopeful, and then she found that she could not quite look away. There was something in the set of his face that was different from the excitement or the discomfort or the indifference she saw in the rest of the crowd. He was watching her with an expression she could not entirely name, but it was not the expression of a man watching a spectacle. It was the expression of a man who was thinking very hard and very carefully about something. Deke Hollis raised his bid to $75 and looked around with the satisfaction of a man who believed the matter was already settled. Voss began the countdown. He did it slowly, theatrically, the way he did everything when he had an audience. $75 going once, Voss called out, his voice carrying easily over the murmuring crowd. Myrtle closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. She thought of her father and forgave him. She thought of the life she had imagined for herself and held it for a moment like something she was setting down permanently. Going twice. And then, from the back row, in a voice that was not loud but was somehow the clearest sound on the entire street, a single word cut through the evening air like a blade through silk. Not $5, not 50. $500, because the quality and conviction of the voice made the number enormous, and the entire crowd went instantly and completely silent, turning to look at the tall man who had stepped forward half a pace from the back row. Voss stopped smiling for the first time all evening. Deke Hollis turned around with his face going dark red. Myrtle opened her eyes. The man from the back row was Jonas McCree, and he was 28 years old, and he had arrived in Caldwell 9 days ago with a horse, a bedroll, a modest amount of money he had saved over 5 years of working cattle drives from Texas to the northern ranges, and no particular plan beyond finding a quiet place to settle. He had not planned on this. He had not planned on any of this. He had been walking past on his way to the general store when he heard the crowd, and then heard what the crowd was gathered for, and he had stopped and stood in the back row and watched, and something in him had gone very quiet and very certain in the way that things sometimes do when a person is confronted with something they cannot turn away from in good conscience. He had exactly $480 in his money belt. He had counted it that morning. He stepped forward through the crowd, which parted for him in the way crowds part for someone who projects absolute conviction even when they are doing something terrifying, and he walked to the front where Voss stood, and he reached into his coat and brought out his money belt and counted out $500 onto the top railing of the platform in front of Harlan Voss. "That's more than her debt," Voss said, his voice flat and carefully controlled. "I know it," Jonas said. He had a low, unhurried voice, the kind that suggested he did not say things unless he meant them. "The extra 40 covers the inconvenience of undoing whatever legal fiction you constructed to make this happen. And you will sign a paper tonight stating the debt is cleared and you have no further claim on this woman or her property." Voss stared at him for a long moment. The crowd was profoundly silent. Deke Hollis looked like he was considering saying something and then thought better of it. "You got no standing here," Voss said. "I got $500, Jonas said. which is what you established as the thing that gives a man standing. Your rules. The logic was simple and absolute, and Voss knew it. And Harlan Voss was many things, but he was not stupid enough to refuse cash money in front of a crowd while making a speech about legality. He picked up the bills and counted them himself slowly, and then he nodded once, and one of his men cut the rope from Myrtle's wrists. Myrtle stepped down from the platform on legs that were steadier than she expected them to be, given everything, and she stood in front of Jonas McCree and looked at him directly. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "I know. You spent $500 on a woman you don't know." "I spent $500 on the principle that nobody ought to be auctioned off like a piece of livestock," he said. "What you do after this is entirely your own decision." She studied him for a moment. He held her gaze without flinching and without any of the expectation she had feared she would see, the assumption that purchasing her meant owning her. There was nothing of that in his face. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jonas McCree." "Myrtle Merriweather," she said, and some of the tension in her shoulders released itself almost imperceptibly. "I'll pay you back." "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'm telling you I will." Something in the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but related to one. "All right," he said. Before they could say anything more, Voss's voice came across the crowd again, smooth and unruffled, already adjusting to circumstances the way water adjusts to a new shape of container. "The arrangement still stands," Voss called out. "The man paid for a wife. You'll be married by end of week, McCree, or I'll be requiring the return of my entertainment and the reinstatement of the debt." Jonas turned to look at Voss. Myrtle turned to look at Jonas. "There's no legal basis for that claim," Jonas said. "Reverend Poole's right there," Voss said pleasantly, nodding toward the edge of the crowd where a thin, elderly man in a dark coat stood looking uncomfortable. "And Sheriff Braddock witnessed the whole transaction. In Caldwell, that's sufficient basis for anything I decide needs a basis." It was extortion dressed in the language of civic order, and everyone on the street knew it, and Jonas knew it, and there was a moment of silence during which several things happened at once in the space of a few seconds. Jonas looked at Myrtle. Myrtle looked at Jonas, and between them passed something wordless and complicated and entirely honest. "That's your call to make," Jonas said to her, quietly enough that it was only for her ears. "Not mine." Myrtle Merriweather had spent the last 8 months fighting alone, and she had lost, and she was standing on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, with chafed wrists and no money and a ruined life, and exactly one person in the world who had chosen, voluntarily and without obligation, to stand up for her. And that person was asking her permission rather than making the decision for her. She looked at Voss, and then she looked at Jonas, and she made a decision that she would spend a long time afterward examining from every angle, and what she found each time she examined it was that it had been the right one. "All right," she said, "but I have conditions." Jonas nodded seriously. "Tell me." "You don't make decisions for me without asking first. You don't touch me or expect anything from me that I haven't offered, and you give me time." "All of that is more than fair," he said. "And you sleep on the floor," she said. "I've slept on harder things than floors," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth did move definitively into something that qualified as a smile, brief and genuine, before he composed himself again. Reverend Poole performed a brief ceremony on the street in the amber light of that Wednesday evening, his thin voice carrying the words with an apologetic quality that suggested he knew perfectly well what he was participating in, and was not proud of it. Myrtle said the words and Jonas said the words, and the matter was done. And when it was done, Jonas, McCree and Myrtle Merriweather walked side by side away from the crowd in the direction of the house at the edge of town that was still technically Myrtle's. And behind them, Harlan Voss pocketed $500 and considered what his next move would be. The house was small. It had been stripped of most of its furniture over the preceding months as Myrtle had sold things to raise money for the debt. There was a table, 2 chairs, a bed with a straw mattress, and a cold fireplace. A kerosene lamp sat on the windowsill with enough oil left in it for a few hours of light. Jonas stood in the middle of the room and looked around with the quiet assessment of a man who has been in enough different kinds of places to read them accurately. "I'll get wood for the fire," he said. "There's some at the back," Myrtle said. She lit the lamp and set it on the table and stood in the small circle of its light and breath for a moment. She was still trembling slightly, somewhere deep in her muscles, the aftermath of sustained terror that she hadn't allowed herself to show while it was happening. She pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed deliberately. Jonas came back in from the back of the house with an armful of wood and built a fire without being asked to explain himself or be thanked, and within a few minutes there was warmth in the room, and the light from the fire added itself to the kerosene lamp and made the small stripped space feel almost habitable. He folded his coat on the floor near the fire and lay down on it without ceremony. He was asleep, or appeared to be, within what seemed like minutes. Myrtle sat in one of the chairs for a long time watching the fire and trying to understand what had happened to her life. She was married to a stranger. A stranger who had been kind, but a stranger nonetheless. A man she did not know the dimensions of, whose motives she could not yet verify, whose goodness she had only the most preliminary evidence for. She was alive and unchained and warm, which was more than she had expected to be at Sundown, but it was also only the beginning of a situation she didn't yet understand. She lay down on the mattress eventually and pulled the thin blanket over her and listened to the fire settle, and the Kansas wind move through the gaps in the siding, and she thought about how strange it was that the worst day of her life had ended with something that was not, if she was being honest, entirely without hope. In the morning, Jonas was already up when she woke. He had rekindled the fire and there was something warm in the small pot on the grate, a thin porridge made from oats he had apparently brought in his saddlebags. "There are oats," he said by way of explanation, "and I found some salt in the cupboard." "There might be coffee beans," Myrtle said, sitting up and pushing her hair out of her face. "Somewhere near the back of the high shelf. I had a small supply I was hoarding." She found the coffee beans and ground them with the small hand grinder that was one of the few things she had not sold, and she boiled water and made coffee, and they sat at the table across from each other in the pale morning light and ate and drank in a silence that was not entirely uncomfortable. "I want to understand your situation clearly," Jonas said, after a while. "The debt is cleared. Voss has no legal claim on you now. But a man like that doesn't let things go simply because the legal grounds have shifted. He'll be looking for another angle." "I know that," Myrtle said. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "He's been the power in this town for 12 years. The sheriff is his creature. The judge that comes through circuit is friendly with him. The only law that doesn't bend to him is the federal marshal, and the federal marshal is 3 days' ride from here. What about the town itself? The merchants, the other people? They're afraid of him. There are a few who aren't, but they've learned it doesn't pay to be openly opposed. Old Sela's hatcher at the general store has some spine. Widow Calloway, who runs the hotel. Doc Alderman, who will quietly help anyone who's been hurt by Voss's men but won't stand up in a public room and say so." Jonas was quiet, turning his coffee cup slowly between his large hands. He had good hands, she noticed. Scarred in the way of a man who worked but careful in their movements. "Are you planning to stay in Caldwell?" she asked. "I was planning to settle somewhere," he said. "I've been driving cattle since I was 19. I had it in mind to find a piece of land, start something of my own." He looked at her directly. "That plan hasn't changed necessarily, it's just gotten more complicated." "You don't have to feel obligated to me," she said. "You've done more than enough." "I don't feel obligated," he said. "I feel invested." He paused, as if considering whether to say more, and then decided to continue. "I grew up in circumstances that were not so different from yours. Not the same, but similar in the way that matters. My mother was widowed when I was 10, and there were men who tried to use that against her. She had no one to stand up for her, and it cost her everything. I'm not going to walk past a woman in the same position and tell myself it's not my business." Myrtle looked at him steadily across the table. "That's a good reason," she said. But I want you to be clear for your own sake that the debt between us is a moral one, not a practical one. I won't be beholden to you in the way Voss intended, not ever. I understand that, he said. I never intended anything else. They sat with that for a moment, and the fire crackled, and outside the wind moved along the street, and somewhere a rooster was making his particular objections to the morning. "Can you ride?" he asked. "My father taught me when I was 6, she said. "Good. I want to look at the land around here, get a sense of what's available, what a man might realistically claim. If I'm going to be in Caldwell, I want to understand the geography." "I know this area," she said. "I grew up here. I can show you things you won't find on any surveyor's map." He looked at her with something that was beginning, very slightly, to resemble warmth. "I'd appreciate that," he said. They borrowed a second horse from Sela's hatcher at the general store, who lent it readily enough and gave them both a look of such relieved approval that Myrtle understood the old storekeeper had been frightened for her. She had not known that before, and it moved her in a way she had not expected. They rode out east of town first, through the low golden grass that stretched out to the horizon in that particular October manner of the Kansas plains, vast and still and faintly melancholy in a beautiful way. The sky was enormous overhead, the kind of sky that exists in that part of the world with almost oppressive grandeur, blue from edge to edge with great banks of white cloud moving slowly from the northwest. Myrtle rode with confidence, which Jonas watched without comment but with appreciation. She knew the land in the precise, practical way of someone who had grown up in it, who had walked it and ridden it and studied it from childhood. And she pointed out things as they went, the places where the creek ran reliable year-round and the places where it dried up in August, the shallow depression to the northeast that filled with water every spring and made the grass around it particularly rich, the stand of cottonwoods that marked a spot where the earth rose just enough to give a house some shelter from the north wind. "There," she said at one point, reining up on a low rise. "My father always said that if he could have chosen, he would have built here. Good drainage, enough elevation to see anyone coming from 3 directions, the creek within walking distance, south-facing slope, so the house would get winter sun." Jonas sat beside her on his horse and looked at the land below them. It was a quiet morning, the kind that makes sound carry very cleanly, and he could hear the creek from where they stood. "How many acres do you estimate?" he asked. "To the creek bank on the east, to that line of stones on the north, to where the land drops again on the south, you're looking at maybe 300 acres, she said. "Half grassland, half that would need breaking up, some timber in the creek bottom." "Who holds it currently?" "Nobody," she said. "My father tried to file on it once, but Voss decided he wanted it and frightened him off the claim. Voss never did anything with it. He just didn't want anyone else to have it." Jonas turned to look at her. "A homestead claim is federal," he said, "not subject to Voss's authority." "Not subject to his legal authority," she said. "There's a difference between what's legal and what Voss permits. I spent enough years moving cattle through places where men like Voss set themselves up as the law," Jonas said. "They always fall eventually, not always quickly and not always without cost, but they fall." He turned back to look at the land. "I'm going to file on this land. He won't like that." "I know. He'll make trouble for you." "I imagine so." He was still looking at the land with the expression of a man who is measuring something and finding it right. "That's why I'm going to do it properly, on the federal record, and why I'm going to let the Federal Land Office know that I expect the claim to be respected, and that I'll be writing to the nearest federal marshal's office to establish that record clearly." Myrtle looked at him for a long moment. The wind was pulling strands of her hair loose from the knot at the back of her neck, and the morning sun was in her face, and she was thinking that this man from the back row of last night's crowd was turning out to be considerably more complex and considerably more formidable than the simple quiet of his presence had initially suggested. "You've done this before," she said. "Stood up against someone like Voss." "Once or twice," he said, in a way that suggested it had been more than twice, but that he was not inclined toward self-advertisement. They rode back to town by midday, and Jonas spent the afternoon at the land office, which was a small dusty room off the back of the post office staffed by a clerk named Henderson, who was visibly uncomfortable at the sight of him, and who nonetheless, because federal land laws were federal land laws, and he was not prepared to break them on Voss's behalf, processed the homestead filing without obstruction. By the time Jonas walked out of the land office with the preliminary filing papers in hand, the news had spread through Caldwell with the efficiency that small towns always manage for news of consequence, and when he passed the Lucky Star Saloon, Harlan Voss was standing on the boardwalk in front of it with his thumbs in his belt loops and his cold January eyes steady on Jonas's face. "You're making a mistake," Voss said pleasantly. "I've filed a federal homestead claim on the northeast parcel," Jonas said, stopping but not approaching closer. "The filing is on record in Henderson's office, and I've written a letter to the federal land commissioner in Topeka notifying him of the claim. If anything happens to me or to my property or to my wife, I have arranged for a copy of that letter and a full account of last night's auction to reach the federal marshal's office in Wichita." Voss's smile remained exactly where it was, but something shifted behind his eyes. "You're a careful man," he said. "I've learned to be," Jonas said. He walked on, and he felt Voss's eyes on his back the whole way down the street, and he did not alter his pace or look back. It was important not to look back. Myrtle had spent the afternoon with Widow Calloway at the hotel, because she needed someone to talk to that she trusted, and Sarah Calloway was a compact, sharp-eyed woman of 50 who had seen most of what Caldwell had to offer and retained her clear judgment through all of it. She listened to Myrtle's account of the last 24 hours with her hands folded in her lap and her expression moving through several distinct phases. "He spent $500 on a stranger," Sarah Calloway said when Myrtle finished. "He did," Myrtle confirmed, "and then asked permission for everything else." "He did." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Men like that are rare," she said finally. "I would know. I've been watching men in this town for 20 years. "I don't know him," Myrtle said. "I need to know him before I can trust him." "Of course you do," Sarah said. "That's sensible, but there's a quality of character that shows itself in the first moments of a thing, and what you're describing is a man of quality." She paused. "Also $500. "Also $500, Myrtle agreed, and despite everything, she felt the first small laugh she had been able to produce in a long while move through her, brief and startled and genuine. The weeks that followed were full of work, which was, Myrtle had always found, the best remedy for sustained fear. Jonas began breaking ground on the northeast parcel, which meant rising before dawn and riding out with tools he borrowed or bought piece by piece as his small reserve of money permitted. The $500 was gone, but he had a few dollars remaining from the trail work, and he spent it carefully, and he worked the land with a thoroughness that Myrtle, who rode out frequently to see the progress, found genuinely impressive. She began to see him differently in those weeks, because work reveals a person in ways that conversation cannot. She saw that he was patient, which was a quality she valued enormously. She saw that he did not waste effort, that he planned before he acted, and then acted without hesitation once the plan was clear. She saw that he was courteous to everyone he dealt with, not in a performative way but in the simple, automatic manner of a person who believes other people deserve courtesy as a baseline. She also saw, because she was a practical woman, that he was objectively good-looking in the way that tends to grow on a person rather than announcing itself, the kind of face that rewards prolonged attention. She noticed this and filed it away and did nothing about it, because she had promised herself time, and she intended to keep that promise to herself. He kept every condition she had set without apparent difficulty. He slept on the floor by the fire for the first 3 weeks, and he asked before making decisions that affected them both, and he gave her the space she needed. And on the rare occasions when she pulled back from something, he simply accepted it without making it into a larger moment than it needed to be. He also, she discovered gradually, had a sense of humor that was bone dry and completely unexpected, and made her laugh at moments she had not seen coming. It happened first about 2.5 weeks in, when they were eating supper, and she mentioned that she'd had a difficult afternoon with old Henderson at the land office, who had been rude to her about some question she had asked. "Henderson has been rude to everyone for 30 years, Jonas said, in a tone of the most neutral observation. I expect it's what he does instead of hobbies." She had laughed, and he had looked at her with a small, pleased expression, and then they had both looked away, and neither of them said anything about it. But something had shifted, barely perceptibly, like the first movement of ice at the end of winter. He moved into the house properly on a day in late November, by which he meant that he stopped sleeping on the floor and began sleeping on one side of the bed, which Myrtle had offered with a straightforwardness that was itself a kind of trust, because she had understood by then that he would honor whatever boundaries she set. He slept on the far edge of the bed with a careful distance between them, and she was grateful for it, and also, somewhere she didn't entirely want to examine, aware of it. The house began to fill up slowly. Jonas was a man of practical skills, and he built things when he had time: a proper shelf for the kitchen, a stand for the water basin, a simple but solid table to replace the one she had sold. He did these things in the evenings after supper, by firelight and lamplight, and Myrtle sat and read when she had a book or mended what needed mending, and they talked sometimes and were quiet together sometimes, and both of those things were comfortable. She told him about her father during one of those evenings, the way he had really been before the gambling got its teeth into him, the intelligent, funny, gentle man who had taught her to ride and to read, and to name the constellations, and who had loved her mother with such wholeness that, when her mother died of fever when Myrtle was 15, something in him had broken quietly and never been repaired. Jonas listened without interrupting, which was the thing she valued most about his listening. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like he was a good man who lost his way," Jonas said. "He was," Myrtle said. "I was angry at him for a long time. I'm not anymore." "Grief can take a person sideways," Jonas said, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested he knew this from the inside rather than from observation. "Your mother?" she asked gently. He was quiet for a moment, turning the small piece of wood he'd been shaping in his hands. "She died the year I turned 20, he said. "I was on the trail. I got back and she was already gone 3 weeks. The neighbor woman told me." He paused. "She had kept herself going a long time through sheer will. I think she let go once she knew I was old enough to manage without her." "I'm sorry," Myrtle said. "It was 8 years ago," he said. "But I'm sorry too. She was a remarkable woman." They were quiet together for a while after that, the fire burning steadily, the Kansas wind doing its November work around the corners of the house, and Myrtle felt the shape of the silence between them and found it warm. December came with hard cold and the first serious snow, which turned the Kansas plains into something both beautiful and severe. The grass buried, and the creek slowed almost to stillness under a skin of ice. Jonas had managed to get a small structure up on the northeast parcel before the ground froze entirely, a basic one-room soddy that would serve as a starting point, though they were still living in Myrtle's house in town for the winter, which made practical sense. Harlan Voss had been quiet since the confrontation on the boardwalk, which made Jonas more rather than less watchful. Quiet from a man like Voss was not peace. It was planning. The trouble came in mid-December, on a particularly cold evening when Jonas had ridden out to check on the soddy on the claim after hearing from Silas Hatcher that someone had been seen riding on that section of land. He came back after dark with his face closed down in the particular way it got when he was controlling something difficult. He had found the soddy's door broken off its hinges and the interior ransacked, the simple supplies he had stored there thrown about or spoiled, and a message burned into one of the wooden corner posts with what had evidently been a branding iron. The message said, "Next time it's the house in town." Myrtle looked at his face when he told her this and felt the fear come back, cold and quick, and then she felt something else come up beneath it, something harder. "He's trying to frighten us into abandoning the claim," she said. "Yes," Jonas said. "Are you frightened?" He looked at her directly. "Of the damage, no. Of what he might do to you, yes." She felt that settle somewhere in her. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to." He pulled off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door. "I'm riding to Wichita tomorrow. The letter I sent to the federal marshal's office got a reply last week. The marshal's name is Everett Coles, and he says he can come through Caldwell on his January circuit if there's sufficient grounds for a visit. I believe last night qualifies as sufficient grounds." "Voss has friends in Wichita," Myrtle said carefully. "Marshal Coles is a federal officer," Jonas said. "Voss's friendships don't reach that high. The federal government has been trying to establish proper legal authority across the territories and the newer states for years now. A man destroying homestead property and threatening violence against a legal claim is exactly the kind of thing they want to act on." Myrtle nodded slowly. "How long will you be gone?" 3 days, maybe 4 depending on the weather." He looked at her with a concern that he didn't try to hide. "I don't want to leave you here alone." "I'll stay with Sarah Calloway," she said. "Voss won't touch the hotel. Sarah's establishment is one of the few things in this town that isn't his, and he knows that if something happened to Sarah's place, the backlash from the traveling men who depend on it would cost him more than he'd gain." "That's good thinking," he said. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Myrtle," just her name, just like that, with something in the quality of it that made her pay attention. "What?" she said. He seemed to be deciding something. "I want you to know that whatever happens with the marshal and with Voss and with all of it, my intention is to remain here, in Caldwell, on that land." He paused. "And in this house." She met his eyes across the room, and there was a long moment that had a different quality than anything that had passed between them before, a current in it, an acknowledgement of something that had been building quietly in the background of all their evenings and mornings and practical conversations and careful distances. "I know," she said softly. "I'm glad of it." She turned back to the fire before either of them could say anything that the moment was not quite ready for, and he went to the washstand, and she listened to the quiet sounds of the household and felt something in her chest that was warm and frightened and hopeful all at once. Jonas rode to Wichita the next morning, and Myrtle moved herself to Sarah Calloway's hotel, and for 4 days she helped Sarah in the kitchen and talked with her in the evenings and thought about Jonas McCree with a frequency that she found both natural and somewhat alarming. Sarah watched her with the expression of a woman who has seen this particular internal weather before and is very fond of it. "You care about him," Sarah said on the 3rd evening. "I've known him less than 2 months, Myrtle said. "I know," Sarah said patiently. "You care about him." Myrtle looked at her hands. "He's a good man," she said. "I'm still learning what that means." "You know what it means," Sarah said. "You're just being careful, which is the right instinct. But there's a difference between being careful and being afraid of something good because it arrived in an unusual way." Myrtle thought about that for a long time after she went to bed, lying in the small, clean room of Sarah's hotel, listening to the wind that seemed to never quite stop in Kansas, and she thought about Jonas's hands and Jonas's voice, and the way he had stood in the back row of a crowd, and said one word that had changed the direction of her life. Jonas came back on the 4th day, in the late afternoon, and he came back with news. Marshal Everett Coles would be in Caldwell in the 2nd week of January. He was a federal officer with full authority and no connection to Harlan Voss, and he had been briefed on the situation by letter and was, Jonas said, not a man who took vandalism against federal homestead claims lightly. Voss, when he heard the news, which he heard within hours because news in Caldwell traveled at its usual speed, became very still and very thoughtful. He stopped making obvious moves against the claim, which was significant. He was recalculating. Christmas came, which Myrtle had not expected to matter much, given everything, and then it mattered considerably because Jonas came home on Christmas Eve with a small pine tree he had cut from the creek bottom, and a length of red ribbon he had found at Sela's Hatcher's store, and he set the tree up in the corner of the house, and tied the ribbon in a bow at the top, and stood back and looked at it with an expression that was almost shy, as if he was uncertain whether this had been a foolish gesture. Myrtle looked at the tree and felt her throat tighten in a way that she would not have predicted, and that she was not going to explain to anyone, including herself. "I haven't had a Christmas tree since my mother was alive," she said when she trusted her voice. "Neither have I," he said. They stood looking at it together for a moment, the small tree with its one piece of red ribbon, the firelight moving on the walls, the cold Kansas night held back by the windows. "It's very beautiful," she said. "It's a small tree with one piece of ribbon," he said. "It's very beautiful," she said again firmly, and she looked at him sideways and he looked back, and the warmth between them was enormous, the kind of warmth that doesn't have anything to do with temperature. He gave her, for Christmas, a small book he had found at the back of Sela's Hatcher's store, a collection of poems by Emily Dickinson, published in 1878, practically new. She held it in both hands and thought she might actually cry, which she had not done through any of the genuinely terrible things that had happened to her this year, and found that deeply revealing about her own emotional geography. She gave him, for Christmas, a pair of gloves she had knitted from yarn Sarah Calloway had provided, sitting up late in the hotel by lamplight during the 4 days he was in Wichita. They were plain, sturdy gloves, well made, and she had measured them against the pair she had found in his coat pocket when she was mending a torn seam, so they fit properly. He put them on and flexed his hands and looked at them with an expression she recognized now as the expression he wore when he was moved by something and was not going to say so out loud. "Thank you," he said. "You needed new ones," she said practically. "The other pair has a hole in the right thumb." "I know," he said. "I've been wearing them anyway." "I know you have," she said. "I fixed the hole too." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the tree stood in the corner with its red ribbon, and outside the Kansas night was clear and enormous and cold and full of stars. He kissed her that night finally, or rather she kissed him first, which surprised both of them. They had been sitting by the fire after supper, and she had been reading from the Dickinson book aloud, a poem she liked particularly, and when she looked up, he was watching her with an expression so entirely unguarded and so plainly warm that she had simply leaned forward and done it, and then held very still for the half-second that followed to see what he did. What he did was kiss her back, carefully and with a great deal of feeling, and the careful quality of it was exactly right, and when they separated they were both very quiet for a moment. "Myrtle," he said. "I know," she said. "I know this is fast. I know it's unusual. I know we met under circumstances that were none of that matters to me," he said. "I want to make sure it doesn't matter to you for the wrong reasons." She thought about what Sarah Calloway had said about the difference between being careful and being afraid of something good because of how it arrived. "It doesn't," she said. "I've been careful. I've taken my time. I know what I feel." "What do you feel?" he asked quietly. She looked at the fire for a moment. "Like I'm home," she said. "For the first time since my mother died, I feel like I'm somewhere I want to be." She looked back at him. "That's you. That's because of you." He reached across and took her hand very deliberately, and she let him, and they sat that way by the fire on Christmas Eve, and the Kansas stars were brilliant above the plains, and there was no need to say anything more. The new year came in with a blizzard that closed Caldwell down for 3 days and left Jonas and Myrtle confined to the house together, with nothing to do but talk and read and play cards with the battered deck Jonas had in his saddlebag, and cook what they had in the larder, which was enough but not lavish. They were easy with each other by then, the ease of people who have spent months in close proximity and discovered that the proximity suits them, and the 3 days of the blizzard felt less like confinement and more like a gift. She beat him at cards consistently, and he accepted this with such good grace that she became mildly suspicious and asked him directly whether he was letting her win. "Letting you win would require me to be better at cards than you," he said seriously, "which I am not." "You've been on cattle drives for 9 years," she said. "Men on cattle drives play cards constantly. They also lose constantly," he said. "It's the nature of the enterprise." She laughed, and he watched her laugh with the expression she had come to understand was as close as he got to showing uncomplicated happiness. And the blizzard howled outside, and the fire was warm, and the small house was full of something that felt remarkably like joy. Marshal Everett Coles arrived in Caldwell on the 12th of January, 1879, on a gray horse with a federal badge on his coat and the businesslike air of a man who has a lot of territory to cover and does not waste time. He was a man of 50, weathered and direct, with a gray beard and intelligent eyes, and he met with Jonas and Myrtle that first afternoon in Sela's hatcher's back room, which was the most reliably private space available. He listened to everything with his hands flat on the table and his face carefully neutral. He had Jonas's letters and his own investigation, which he'd conducted by correspondence before coming. He knew about the auction, though the legal mechanism of it made it technically complex rather than simply illegal, because Voss had been careful enough to dress it in the language of debt settlement. He knew about the homestead vandalism. He knew about the sheriff's relationship with Voss. "The auction itself is on the edge of what I can prosecute federally," Marshal Coles said. "The debt arrangement, the way Voss constructed it, is ugly but not unambiguously criminal under current statute. A good lawyer might make something of it, but it would be slow and uncertain." "What about the homestead?" Jonas asked. "Destruction of property on a federal homestead claim is a federal matter," Coles said. "That's clear. I can charge Voss for that, or whoever he sent to do it, if we can establish who that was." "There's a man named Ren Dubois who does Voss's dirty work," Myrtle said. "Everyone in town knows it. Getting anyone to testify to it is the problem." "I can talk to people," Coles said. "A federal marshal asking questions has a different weight than a neighbor asking questions." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know, Mrs. McCree, that what was done to you was wrong. I cannot make it as legally clear as I would like because the law is not always as sharp as the wrong requires, but I want to say it plainly so it's on record in some fashion." Myrtle met his eyes. "I appreciate that," she said. Marshal Coles spent 4 days in Caldwell. He talked to Sela's hatcher and Sarah Calloway and Doc Alderman and 6 other townspeople, and he talked to Sheriff Braddock in a conversation that was apparently brief and pointed. And by the end of it, he had sufficient affidavits regarding Ren Dubois and the homestead vandalism to issue a formal federal charge. Ren Dubois was arrested on a Friday morning and taken to Wichita. Sheriff Braddock, facing a federal officer with documented evidence of his own complicity in several of Voss's schemes, resigned quietly on Saturday. Voss himself could not be charged for the things Myrtle cared most about, and she sat with that for several days after Coles rode out, the knowledge that the law had not quite reached the thing that had most needed reaching. But Dubois was gone and Braddock was gone, and Voss had been publicly noted by a federal marshal's official report, which meant any further action he took would be taken by a man who was now on record with the federal government. It changed him. Not immediately, and not in any way that made him into a better person, but the visible authority in Caldwell shifted. The new sheriff, appointed from Topeka pending a proper election, was a man named Garrison who was not Voss's creature. The balance of the town began, slowly and unevenly, to correct itself. Jonas filed his homestead claim properly with the additional documentation Coles helped him prepare, and the claim was on federal record and irrefutable, and he went back to the land in the slow thaw of late February and began the real work of building. Myrtle went with him. She had talked to Sarah Calloway about selling the house in town and had gotten a fair enough price that, added to what Jonas had remaining and what he earned from helping with other men's cattle work during the winter months, gave them a sufficient start. She was not afraid of hard work. She had never been afraid of hard work. She had simply been, for a long time, afraid of the kind of hopelessness that settles into a person when hard work produces nothing but more struggle. This was different. This was working towards something, and it had a different quality entirely, the kind of work that builds rather than merely sustains. They built the proper house in the spring, with help from Silas Hatcher and two brothers named Pierce who had a homestead 3 miles east, and who were good neighbors in the practical, unsentimentalized way of frontier people, who understood that community was not optional. Jonas worked with his hands in a way that demonstrated years of accumulated competence, and Myrtle worked alongside him, not as a helper, but as an equal partner in the construction of the thing that was going to be their life. The house went up over 6 weeks, solid, larger than the soddy, with a real wooden floor and 2 rooms and a proper chimney and a covered porch that faced south and caught the afternoon sun. It was not beautiful in an ornate way. It was beautiful in the way of things that are well made and fitted to their purpose, and when it was done they stood on the porch together in the late April light and looked at the land around them, the creek flashing in the distance, the grass coming up green after the long winter, the sky doing its Kansas thing of being more sky than a person could quite contain. "We built that," Myrtle said. "We did," Jonas said. She leaned against him, the first time she had done it without thinking about it first, simply leaning against the solidity of him because he was there and it was where she wanted to be, and his arm came around her with the same naturalness, and they stood there for a long while. She had been thinking about something for several weeks by then, had been turning it over and approaching it from different angles and finding that she arrived at the same answer each time, and she had decided she was going to say it plainly because that was how she preferred to do things. "I love you," she said. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just as a fact she was offering him clearly. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass below the house. "I've been in love with you since sometime in November," he said, "and I've been waiting to say so until I was sure you were ready to hear it." She turned to look up at him. "You could have told me sooner." "You needed time," he said. "I could see that." "You gave it to me," she said. "Of course I did," he said simply, as if it had not been any kind of sacrifice. She kissed him in the afternoon sun on the porch of the house they had built, and it was nothing like the careful, tentative kiss on Christmas Eve. This was the kiss of two people who know each other, who have chosen each other with full information and full consciousness, and it went on long enough that a hawk passing overhead might have noted it with approval. That summer was the richest of Myrtle's life. She planted a kitchen garden with more variety than she had managed in years, tomatoes and beans and squash and potatoes, and the herbs her mother had always grown. And the Kansas summer, which could be brutal, was merely warm that year, with enough rain to keep things growing. Jonas turned more of the land, and they got 2 cattle to start with and 4 chickens and a pig, and the homestead began to look and feel and function like what it was meant to be. They had visitors. The Pierce brothers came by regularly, and Sarah Calloway rode out twice in the summer on one of the hotel's horses, sitting on the porch and drinking coffee and looking at the view with an expression of profound satisfaction. Doc Alderman came once, ostensibly to check that they had sufficient medical supplies on hand for the remote location, and stayed for 3 hours talking about books, which was his particular passion. Silas Hatcher, who had been quietly fond of Myrtle since her childhood, brought them a properly cured ham for no occasion and would not accept anything in return. "Your father was a good man," he said to Myrtle, pressing the wrapped parcel into her hands. "He'd be pleased. About all of it." He looked at Jonas with a measuring expression that apparently produced a favorable result, because he nodded once and got back on his horse and rode away without saying anything more. Jonas watched him go. "That was an assessment," he said. "Yes," Myrtle said. "You passed." "Good," he said. Harlan Voss made one more attempt, in August, which was not violent but was a kind of legal maneuver involving a competing claim to the water rights on the creek that ran along the east boundary of the homestead. He had found a lawyer from Dodge City who was willing to argue the case. Jonas found his own lawyer, a woman named Clara Bassett who had come to Caldwell in the spring and set up a small practice, and who was, by all evidence, sharper than anyone Voss had ever dealt with in a legal context. Clara Bassett argued the water rights case in front of the circuit judge in early September, and won it with such thoroughness that even the judge looked slightly impressed against his will. The creek remained part of the McCree homestead. Voss paid the Dodge City lawyer a sum that evidently annoyed him, and did not come back with another angle. He left Caldwell entirely that winter, which was a thing nobody had predicted, and which the town took a while to believe, and then absorbed with the quiet collective relief of people who have been living under a particular pressure for a long time and have finally been released from it. He went east, reportedly, though nobody in Caldwell knew exactly where, and nobody in Caldwell lost any sleep over it. The Lucky Star Saloon was sold to a man from St. Louis who had a wife and 3 children, and who ran it with considerably less drama. The boarding houses were sold separately and subsequently managed by their new owners with no particular incident. The shape of Caldwell changed, slowly, the way towns do when a particular gravitational force is removed from their center. Garrison, the new sheriff, won the properly conducted election in November and ran an office that was notably free of corruption, which the townspeople found almost disorienting after a decade of the alternative. Myrtle and Jonas did not have a great deal to do with town politics directly, being primarily occupied with the work of the homestead, but they felt the change in the air when they rode in, which they did every week or two for supplies and Post and Company. The main street of Caldwell felt different, less like a stage where someone else was always controlling the production. The autumn of 1879 was golden and long, the Kansas plains holding their warmth well into October, and the homestead was in good shape for winter with the root cellar full, and the woodpile high, and the cattle settled. Jonas had brought in 2 more cattle over the summer, and there were 10 chickens now, and the pig had produced a litter that they'd sold half of and kept 2 of, and the kitchen garden had produced more than they needed. So Myrtle had put up jars of things in numbers that made the root cellar look like an optimistic vision of abundance. One evening in late October, Jonas came in from the barn to find Myrtle sitting at the table with a particular expression that he had learned, over the course of nearly a year of close attention to her face, to identify as the expression she wore when she was holding something significant. He washed his hands and sat down across from her and looked at her steadily. "I'm expecting," she said. The words sat between them in the lamplight. Jonas looked at her and then looked at the table and then looked at her again, and the expression on his face went through several things very quickly before settling into something that was not quite like anything she had seen on him before. It was joy, but the deep, almost awed variety, the kind that doesn't know quite what to do with itself. "You're certain?" he said. "Reasonably certain," she said. "Doc Alderman confirmed it yesterday." She paused. "I wanted to be sure before I told you." "You went to see Doc Alderman before you told me," he said. "I wanted to be sure," she said again. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair so they were at eye level, which was a Jonas thing, this particular way of getting level with her for important conversations, and she had always found it deeply endearing. "Myrtle," he said. "I know," she said, and she was smiling and her eyes were bright in the lamplight. "I am very happy," he said, with such complete simplicity that it was more moving than any elaborate expression of feeling could have been. "I am too," she said. "I was frightened for about an hour this morning. And then I thought about it more carefully and realized I wasn't frightened anymore." He took both her hands in his large, careful hands and held them. "We'll be good at this," he said. "I can't tell you how I know that, but I know it." "I know it too," she said. She was right that it went well. The pregnancy was not easy in its early months, with a persistent nausea that made the mornings difficult. But she was strong, and the land was kind that winter, and Jonas took over more of the outdoor work without being asked, and without making a production of it. He just quietly picked up what she put down, and when she was feeling well enough she worked alongside him, and when she wasn't he managed without complaint. Sarah Calloway came out to the homestead twice over the winter because she had useful knowledge about these matters and was determined to share it. And she and Myrtle sat at the table and talked in the frank, practical way of women who have decided to be genuinely useful to each other. And Jonas found things to do in the barn during these conversations with a tactfulness that Myrtle appreciated. Doc Alderman came out in the spring to check on her progress and found everything as it should be, and said so with the blunt reassurance of a man who deals in facts. Their son was born on a morning in June of 1880, when the Kansas sky was the kind of blue that seems like an overstatement, and the meadowlarks were carrying on in the long grass with their usual extravagance. It was a hard morning, the kind that Doc Alderman had been honest enough to prepare her for, and Jonas was not permitted in the room by the custom of the time, but he was right outside the door the entire time, and she could hear him there. The particular quality of a person being still when stillness is the only available option. When the baby arrived and made his first objection to the external world known, the sound Jonas produced from the other side of the door was involuntary and low, and she recognized it as the sound of enormous relief. They named the baby Thomas for her father, and the middle name was William, for Jonas's father, who had died before Jonas had a chance to know him well. Thomas William McCree arrived in the world weighing a solid 8 pounds and making his opinions clear about everything from the first moment. And he had Myrtle's green eyes and Jonas's jaw and neither of his parents' patience, but they loved him with a totality that was somewhat shocking in its completeness. Jonas held his son for the first time with a careful precision, as if Thomas were made of something simultaneously precious and fragile, and Thomas looked up at his father with the vague, unfocused stare of the newly arrived, and Jonas looked down at him with an expression that Myrtle, watching from the bed where she was exhausted and triumphant, would remember for the rest of her life. "Hello," Jonas said to his son very quietly, "just hello, nothing more elaborate than that." Thomas yawned enormously. "I agree," Jonas said in the same tone. Myrtle laughed, which hurt her mending body and was entirely worth it. The years that followed were not uniformly simple because nothing in that life was. The cattle work was demanding, and the Kansas weather had its catastrophic moments, including a drought summer 2 years, and that cost them one of the cattle and most of the kitchen garden, and required them to be very careful and very creative about provisions for the winter. There was a hailstorm in the spring of 1882 that took half the roof off the barn and required rebuilding. There were the ordinary small illnesses and broken things and difficult neighbors and hard seasons that are simply the texture of any real life lived close to the land. But they moved through all of it together, and moving through things together turned out to be its own kind of richness. They did not always agree, and there were occasional sharp-edged conversations that Jonas was direct about, and Myrtle was even more direct about. And they had learned over time that they could be in genuine disagreement about something and neither of them would dissolve or retreat. They would simply work through it, and come out on the other side still solid and still warm. Jonas expanded the homestead steadily. He bought an additional 40 acres to the south in 1881, and another 60 to the north in 1883, when a neighbor named Guthrie decided to go back east to family. The cattle herd grew to 12 by 1882 and to 20 by 1884, enough to sell some each year and be genuinely profitable. He built a proper barn after the hailstorm and then a separate structure for the chickens and then a smokehouse, and the homestead looked, by the middle of the decade, like the kind of place that has been properly established rather than merely started. Myrtle ran the household and the kitchen garden with the same careful intelligence she brought to everything, and she also kept the accounts, because she had her father's facility with numbers without his father's disastrous application of it, and she was good at knowing where money needed to go and where it didn't need to go and how to keep the two separate. She also taught, beginning in 1882, at the small schoolhouse the town established, riding in 3 days a week and teaching the children of Caldwell to read and cipher and think, which was a work she found she loved with a surprise that had its own particular pleasure. Thomas grew in the direction of his parents' best qualities, being curious and direct, and capable of extraordinary patience with things he cared about, including his collection of rocks, which he organized and reorganized according to systems that made complete sense to him and defied comprehension to everyone else. He was a happy child who had been given a happy life and knew enough, even at 5 and 6 and 7 years old, to understand that this was not something to take for granted. He had also, from the time he was old enough to pay attention to such things, been watching the way his parents were with each other, with the quiet attentiveness of a child who is absorbing the primary lesson about what people who love each other actually look like. He saw that his father listened when his mother spoke, genuinely listened, not waiting for his turn, but actually tracking what she said. He saw that his mother trusted his father with the difficult things, the real worries, not just the manageable ones. He saw them argue, and he saw them resolve it, and he saw them sit by the fire in the evenings with the particular ease of people who are not performing peace, but are actually at peace, and all of this accumulated in him like water in a good soil. In the autumn of 1884, Myrtle discovered she was expecting again. She told Jonas at the table, in the lamplight, in the same deliberate way she had told him the first time, and the expression on his face was the same deep-moved joy, the variety that knows exactly what it's feeling and can't quite fit it into words. "Thomas will be pleased," Jonas said, when he had composed himself. "Thomas will probably organize a new rock collection in the baby's honor," Myrtle said. "He will absolutely do that," Jonas agreed. Thomas was, in fact, so pleased about the prospect of a sibling that he spent 3 weeks working on a gift for the baby, which turned out to be a selection of 5 rocks that he had determined were the best ones he owned, arranged in a small wooden box that Jonas helped him make. His reasoning was that these were things the baby would need to know about, as soon as it was old enough to understand rocks, and he wanted the baby to have good ones to start with. Their daughter arrived in March of 1885, on a cold, clear morning that smelled of coming spring, and she was smaller than Thomas had been but equally vocal about her opinions. They named her Ruth Eleanor for Jonas's mother. She had Jonas's gray eyes and Myrtle's auburn hair, and was from her first days a person of emphatic and complex personality. Thomas presented his box of rocks to his sister when she was 3 days old, setting it carefully beside her in the cradle with a gravity that made both his parents fight the urge to smile. "These are the good ones," he told her seriously. "When you're bigger, I'll teach you about them." Ruth Eleanor looked at the ceiling and waved one small fist. "I think she's interested," Thomas told his parents. Jonas's expression at this moment was the one Myrtle had been cataloging for 7 years, the compressed warmth in the corner of his mouth that was the most he generally allowed himself in the way of visible tenderness. But she knew it now down to its smallest component, and she took his hand, and he held hers, and they watched their son introduce their daughter to his rock collection in the quiet morning of their home. The homestead entered its full flourishing in the latter half of the 1880s. 28 cattle by 1886, a second milk cow. A proper kitchen garden that Myrtle expanded year by year, trading seeds with neighbors, and with a woman she corresponded with in Colorado, who was developing hardier varieties of various vegetables for the prairie climate. A small orchard of apple trees that Jonas had planted against the south side of a gentle rise, where they got shelter and sun, that were beginning to produce properly by 1887. Jonas's reputation in the county had grown over the years to the point where men sought him for advice on land management and cattle, and he gave it freely and without condescension, because he had always been better at demonstrating a thing than talking about himself. He was still, in the way that he had always been, a man who let his actions speak and kept his words for things that mattered. It was a quality that Myrtle had valued from the first and found that she valued more, not less, as the years went on. She had grown into herself in those years in a way that she sometimes thought about with something close to gratitude, the way a person can only feel gratitude toward their own life when they have genuinely arrived somewhere. She was 30 and then 32 and then 34, and she was a woman with a family and a homestead and a teaching position, and a community and a life that she had built, partly from the ruins of a very bad day in October of 1878, and partly from the unexpected presence of a quiet man who had stood up in a back row and said one word that changed everything. She and Jonas had a conversation one evening, in the autumn of 1887, sitting on the south-facing porch, where the last of the day's light was going down over the grass in colors that still stopped her heart after 9 years of watching it. Thomas was inside doing his lessons, 12 years old now and increasingly interested in the astronomy his mother had been teaching him from a textbook she'd ordered from back east. Ruth Alina was asleep, which she did with a wholehearted commitment that was at odds with her waking personality. "Do you ever think about where you'd be if you'd kept walking that evening?" Myrtle asked. She was not asking it with anxiety, only with the genuine curiosity of someone considering the shape of contingency. Jonas was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon. "I've thought about it," he said. "I would be somewhere less good." "That's a very simple answer." "It's a very simple truth," he said. Turned to look at her, and in the fading light his face was everything she knew, every line of it familiar and still capable of moving her. "I had nothing particular to go to that evening. I just had the walk to the general store and whatever came after it, and what came after it was you." "I was being auctioned off," she said. "You were standing there with your spine straight and your hands bound and your face completely composed," he said. "I thought you were the most remarkable person I had ever seen." "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "That was what made it remarkable. You were terrified and you refused to show it." She looked at him for a long moment. "I saw you in the back row," she said. "Before you stood up, I was looking at every face and I couldn't find anything hopeful, and then I found yours and it was different." "Different how?" he asked. "You were thinking," she said. "Everyone else was watching, but you were thinking, and that was hopeful." He took her hand on the arm of his chair and she let him, and they looked at the last colors draining from the sky together. "I would stand up in that back row again," he said. "Every time. For any version of that evening." She turned her head and looked at him in the near dark. This man she had been given by the worst circumstances of her life, and who had turned out to be everything she had not known she needed. This quiet, careful, formidable, tender person who had given her time and space and respect, and then filled her life with a love so steady it was like the creek in the distance, always there, always moving, clear to the bottom. "I know you would," she said. "That's one of the things I love most about you." The stars were coming out over Kansas, vast and precise and uncountable, the same stars they had looked at from the beginning, the same sky that had watched a woman stand on a platform with bound wrists, and a man stand up in the back of a crowd and say one word. The same sky that had watched a house go up out of good timber and honest work, and 2 children arrive into a life that was ready for them, and a pair of people grow into the shape of each other over years that were hard and rich and theirs. Inside the house, Thomas called out something about a star he was trying to find in the textbook, his voice carrying the particular quality of a boy who has inherited both his parents' curiosity and his father's directness about expressing it. Ruth Alina would wake soon and make her own feelings about the evening known with characteristic clarity. The cattle were settled in the barn, and the apple trees on the south slope held their late autumn shapes against the dimming sky, and the root cellar was full, and the hearth was warm, and the porch held the 2 of them in the last of the light. "We should go in," Myrtle said, not moving. "In a minute," Jonas said, also not moving. The sky darkened above the plains and the stars came down to meet them, and the evening settled over the homestead the way evenings do when they have nothing to hurry about, easy and full of quiet. And Jonas McCree and Myrtle Merriweather sat in the last warmth of a good day, and were completely and without reservation, at home. The years continued to be kind in the way that real kindness is, not without difficulty, but imbued with a fundamental rightness that made the difficulties navigable. Thomas grew into a young man of 17, then 18, with his father's steadiness and his mother's green eyes and a particular gift for the mathematics that made him quietly formidable in ways he barely seemed aware of. He had decided, by the time he was 16, that he wanted to study engineering, had read everything available to him in the county and badgered Doc Alderman, who had more books than anyone else in the area, into lending him texts on physics and applied mathematics. Jonas and Myrtle had talked about this, carefully, the question of how a person pursued serious education from a homestead in Kansas in 1886. What they decided, jointly and without very much disagreement because they agreed on the fundamental thing, was that Thomas's intelligence was a resource, and resources are not wasted. They began to save in a particular way, setting aside a portion of the cattle profits each year toward the cost of a school in the East when Thomas was ready. Ruth Eleanor, 3 years behind her brother, was making equally decisive statements about her own future in the more immediate currency of an 8, 9, 10-year-old who knows her mind. She wanted to be a doctor, she had announced at 9, with the complete confidence of a person who has considered the question and settled it. She had gotten this idea partly from Doc Alderman, who had taken a liking to her direct personality and her quick mind, and had started letting her observe certain things during his visits to the homestead that were probably not entirely conventional for a child of her age but were certainly educational. Doc Alderman, who was in his 60s by then, and had spent 40 years being the single medical resource for a radius of many miles, found in Ruth Eleanor someone to whom he could actually explain things, which was its own particular satisfaction. Myrtle watched her daughter with the recognition of someone who sees herself in a person, and is glad of it, and also alert to the ways they are different. Ruth Eleanor was bolder than Myrtle had been at her age, less careful of other people's comfort, more inclined to simply state the true thing and let others adjust. It was partly the security of a childhood that had never required her to be smaller than she was, and partly simply her own particular nature. Jonas watched his daughter with an expression that Myrtle had no name for but recognized as being made of approximately equal parts pride and gentle awe, the expression of a man who had spent his formative years in a world that was hard in specific ways, and was watching his daughter inhabit a world that was, not perfectly, but meaningfully, less hard. In the summer of 1888, Caldwell held its annual summer fair, which had been a modest affair in the early years of Myrtle's memory and had grown, as the town grew and the surrounding homesteads established themselves, into something genuinely celebratory. There were competitions and music and food, and the particular energy of a community that has found its footing and is pleased about it. Jonas entered the cattle assessment and did well. Thomas won the mathematics competition without very much apparent effort. Ruth Eleanor came second in the baking competition with a pie that Doc Alderman, who was one of the judges, declared the best he had ever tasted, which Myrtle suspected was partly honest and partly the expression of an old man's fondness for a child he had watched grow. It was at the summer fair that year that Myrtle ran into Clara Bassett, the lawyer who had won the water rights case for them 9 years before and who had built herself a solid practice in Caldwell over those years. Clara was 40 now, sharp and a little formidable, and they had stayed in friendly contact over the years. "How is everything?" Clara asked, and meant it the way people who ask real questions mean it. "Good," Myrtle said, and meant it the way people who are telling the unvarnished truth mean it. "Very good, actually." Clara looked at her with the particular clarity of someone who has known her through various versions of the story. "You know," she said, "when I came through Caldwell in 1878 and heard what Voss had done, I was furious. And then I heard what Jonas McCree had done, and I thought, well, There's the counterargument. The counterargument to what? Myrtle asked. To everything that makes a person cynical about human beings, Clara said. Myrtle thought about that. She thought about a Wednesday evening in October, the sun going down in colors over the Kansas street, a crowd gathered like it was nothing more than a sale, and a tall, quiet man in the back row who had stood up and said $500 with such clarity and conviction that the entire history of her life had altered. Yes, she said, he is that. She found Jonas later in the afternoon, standing with the Pierce brothers and two other farmers, talking about the dry spell they'd had in June and its probable effect on the autumn yields, and she came and stood beside him and he shifted without looking, making room for her the way he always did, the small automatic acknowledgement of her presence that had been the same for 10 years and still felt like the most settled thing she knew. He looked down at her a moment later. Everything all right. Everything is very all right, she said. I was just thinking about something. Good thinking or complicated thinking. Grateful thinking, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she knew best of all, the compressed warmth that was the truest version of himself. And then he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she had been leaning into him for a decade, naturally and completely. And the summer fair went on around them with its music and its color and its noise, and the Kansas sky was enormous and generous overhead. And the life they had made from the ruins of a terrible evening was present in every direction, solid and warm and irrefutably theirs. Thomas left for school in the East in the autumn of 1890, 2 weeks after his 18th birthday, with a trunk full of books and the quiet pride of both his parents and $300 they had saved. He wrote letters that came every 2 weeks without fail, long specific letters about what he was learning and the people he was meeting, with an occasional dry observation about something that had clearly come straight from his father's side of his inheritance. He thrived, which was what they had believed he would do, and the knowing of it did not make the empty space at the table any smaller in the first months, but it settled into a different shape eventually. Ruth Eleanor, 15 and growing into the person she had already decided to be, stepped into the slightly larger role that Thomas's absence created with the equanimity of someone who had been preparing for it quietly. She took on more of the homestead accounting, which she was good at, and she spent more time with Doc Alderman, who was teaching her everything he knew with the urgency of a man aware that his years of practice were finite and his knowledge should go somewhere good. The homestead in 1890 was a different thing from what it had been in 1879. 22 cattle, a large kitchen garden that supplied the family and sold surplus to the town market, the apple orchard producing properly now, 2 farmhands hired on seasonally to help with the major work. The house expanded with a second story that Jonas had built over 2 summers with Thomas's help. It was a place that had been made from nothing, or not quite nothing, from hard work and clear intention, and the particular thing that happens when 2 people build something together over years. Myrtle was 34 and then 35. She taught still, 2 days a week now rather than 3, because the town had hired a second teacher and the load was shared. She read voraciously, ordering books through the post in ways that made the postmaster accustomed to heavy packages arriving for Mrs. McCree. She corresponded with women across the territory on matters of education and local politics, and the slow, incremental work of making things better in small but real ways. She was, she understood, happy. Not in the uncomplicated way of a person who has never been tested, but in the deep, rooted way of someone who has been tested considerably and has come through to something that holds. Jonas was 38 and then 39. He was still lean in the way of a man who works, though there were lines in his face now that had not been there in 1878, and the hair at his temples had begun to go to gray in a way that Myrtle found distinguished, and said so, and that Jonas received with the polite skepticism he brought to all compliments about his appearance. He was still the same man in the ways that had mattered from the beginning, still careful, still direct, still more attentive than his general silence suggested, still capable of saying the precisely right thing with the minimum possible number of words. He had, over the years, told her more of his story, because that was how trust works between people who are patient with each other, in accumulating layers. She knew about the cattle drives in detail, the years from 19 to 28 that had been his education in what the world was and how to move through it. She knew about the things he had seen, which were sometimes hard, and the things he had learned, which were valuable. She knew about the men he had worked with and respected, and the few he had not, and the landscape of the American West in the 1870s, as seen from the back of a horse on a cattle trail. She knew that he had been lonely in those years in a way that he had not had adequate words for at the time, a loneliness that was not about the absence of people, because there were always people on a cattle drive, but about the absence of any particular person. He had not spoken of this directly, but she understood it because she understood him. And what she understood was that the man who had stood up in the back row of the crowd that evening in Caldwell had not been just responding to principle, though he had been responding to principle. He had also been, in some way he could not have articulated at the time, responding to her specifically, to the composed and terrible courage of a woman who would not give her fear an audience, and something in him had recognized that and moved toward it. She told him this once on an evening in 1889, putting it into words the way she sometimes did with things she had been working on internally for a long time. He was quiet after she said it, looking at the fire the way he did when he was taking something in fully. "I didn't know that at the time," he said. "I know you didn't," she said. "I'm telling you now because I think it's true." He considered it. "I think it might be true," he said. "I thought I was responding to principle. I was responding to principle, but you're saying there was also something else." "I'm saying the principle met a specific person," Myrtle said, "and the specific person was the part that kept you there." He looked at her across the fire-lit room, and the small smile that lived in the corner of his mouth appeared. "You're not wrong," he said. Thomas came home for Christmas of 1890, and then for summer of 1891, and each time he came he was more himself and more than himself, the way education builds on what's already there when there is something genuinely there to build on. He was doing well. He would go further with it eventually, but that was for later. For now, Christmas of 1890 was the whole family around the table that Jonas had built in the early years of the homestead, the lamp bright, the food good, Ruth Aliner conducting some sort of debate with Thomas about something scientific that neither Jonas nor Myrtle could entirely follow, but that both of them could see their children enjoying with complete engagement. Jonas looked at his wife across the table in that moment, over the heads of their children and through the lamplight and across the years, and Myrtle looked back, and what passed between them did not need words of any kind. It was simply the totality of everything they were to each other, accumulated and present, held between one glance and another. By 1892, the McCree homestead was one of the established places in that part of Kansas, not the largest or the most spectacular, but solid and respected and well-run, the kind of place that other people pointed to when they wanted an example of what it looked like when a homestead worked out properly. The family that lived in it was known in the town. Myrtle, who taught and read and thought and was not afraid to say what she thought about things that mattered, and Jonas, who worked and was careful and was not afraid to act on what he believed, and Thomas, who was off in the East becoming an engineer, and Ruth Aliner, who was going to be a doctor and showed every sign of managing it. They were not a perfect family because perfect families do not exist, but they were a real one, made from genuine things, and they were intact. In the spring of 1892, Ruth Aliner helped Doc Alderman treat a complicated case involving a farmer 3 miles north whose leg had been badly injured in a harvesting accident. And she performed herself with such composure and competence that Doc Alderman told Jonas afterward, with the directness of a man who does not inflate his praise, that she was going to be the finest doctor this part of Kansas had ever seen. Jonas went home and told Myrtle, and Myrtle sat down at the table with her hands in her lap and her face doing several things at once. "I know," she said, finally. "I thought you'd want to hear it from Alderman," Jonas said. "I've known since she was 9 and she told me what she was going to do," Myrtle said. "But hearing it from someone who knows medicine is different." She looked up at him. "She's going to need what Thomas had, the school." "I know," he said. "We have time. She's 16. We'll have it." "You're sure?" He looked at her steadily. "Myrtle, have I ever told you something was going to be all right when I didn't genuinely believe it was going to be all right?" She thought about this. "No," she said. "Then I'm sure," he said. She stood up and crossed the room and put her arms around him, and he held her in the practical, wholehearted way he had of holding her. And outside, the spring was doing its Kansas thing of trying to be both beautiful and severe simultaneously, and inside the house was warm. Ruth Eleanor McCree would, in due course, attend the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania, which had been training women physicians since 1850, and which Ruth Eleanor would find, when she arrived there at 19, to be exactly as demanding and exhilarating as she had imagined. But that was ahead of them still, held in the future the way good things are held. Not certain, because nothing is certain but grounded in intention and work and love. For now, the homestead held its spring, the apple trees breaking into bloom on the south-facing slope, the cattle out in the new grass, the kitchen garden showing the first green of the season's planting. For now, Jonas McCree and Myrtle Merriweather were as they had been for 14 years, which was to say, together, and building and grateful for the specific sequence of events that had arranged itself, on a Wednesday evening in October of 1878, into the shape of a life. She had stood on a platform in the dying light of a sundown with her wrists bound and her heart terrified, and no horizon she could see. He had stood in the back row of a crowd with $500 in a money belt and no plan except the one that was forming in his quiet, careful mind. And between them, in that moment, something had been set in motion that turned out to be very nearly everything. The evening star came out over the McCree homestead on a warm May evening in 1892, appearing in the blue-green of the western sky as reliably as it had always appeared, as it had appeared over Caldwell on an October evening 14 years ago when a man stood up and said one word. Myrtle stood on the south-facing porch and watched it emerge and felt the evening settle around her with its familiar weight of goodness. Jonas came out from the house behind her and stood beside her, and they looked at the star together in the comfortable silence of people who have run out of things they need to say because they have already said them, and who have discovered that the silence on the other side of all those words is one of the finest things there is. The grass moved in the wind, and the apple trees held their late bloom, and the cattle were settled, and the house was warm, and their children were in the world, making their determined and specific ways through it. And the evening came on over the Kansas plains with all its beauty and all its size and all its indifferent abundance. And it was, as it had been for 14 years, and as it would be for all the years still ahead of them, more than enough.